All right, good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, a broader vision of quality of life as economic development policy. My name is Brandon Hofstede, and I am the Community Economic Development Program Manager with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. And it is my pleasure to kick off this webinar focused on the importance of quality of life on economic activity and population growth, with specific attention given to Midwestern communities and understanding what changes might mean for a broader set of economic development policy recommendations. Before we begin, I would like to thank the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Today's meeting was made possible in part by a grant from the U.S. EDA in support of the EDA University Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And as per usual, we do have a few housekeeping items that I want to briefly cover. So first, today's meeting is being recorded. Final video will be posted on our website as soon as we have that ready for prime time. Anyone who is registered will receive that email from us, so you can share it and view it again and go back for the resources. We also have closed captioning for those who may need it. You can find that at the bottom. It has the CC to enable closed captioning. As a friendly reminder, please be sure to mute your microphone when you are not speaking. And we are taking questions throughout or comments, but please do so by dropping those in the chat. I have myself, again, you can find me at the top of the participant list, and my colleague Kristen Runge will both be monitoring. And following our presentation today, we will have an opportunity to ask questions of our presenter. So there will be time, but you can also drop those into the chat if you have questions as we go. So now I'd like to introduce the presenter and also the topic, and I'm going to do this in tandem with my colleague, Dr. Steve Deller. And I'll start with a brief introduction of our presenter, who we are so happy is joining us as a guest presenter today, Dr. Amanda Weinstein. Dr. Weinstein is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Akron. Her research focuses on the determinants of urban and regional economic success and women in the economy. She also studies the factors that lead to economic success and economic decline of places on attracting and keeping a skilled workforce and the importance of enhancing the quality of life in communities. Dr. Weinstein came heavily recommended by Steve, and so we are so happy that she accepted the invitation to present her work with us and share her work with us today. So to keep the main act from you for a little bit longer, I'm going to now turn the stage over to Steve, who's going to talk a little bit about the importance of placemaking and quality of life. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brandon. Two economists at the University of Minnesota Duluth asked a very simple question back in 1972. And the question was, do people follow jobs or do jobs follow people? And all of the research up until recently has consistently found that people follow jobs. And the economic development implication of that is that to promote growth, we should really focus on businesses. We should promote the creation of job opportunities, employment opportunities. But more recently, particularly post-COVID with the advent of remote work and telecommuting, the data seems to be suggesting that that relationship is flipped, that increasingly jobs follow people. If that's true, it kind of turns economic development policy on its head. Rather than focusing narrowly on businesses and employment opportunities, maybe we should be focusing on people and trying to make our community a best place to live and work as possible. That's kind of come out within Wisconsin, a lot of communities in terms of placemaking. And it's not either or, it's a balance of the two. I tend to focus on rural areas, rural Wisconsin. And when I saw the report that Amanda came out with her colleagues from the Brookings Institute, her work tends to focus on urban areas. And when you find that the research that's looking at rural and looking at urban really complement each other, it kind of makes you start to think that maybe something is fundamentally changing here. So I am pleased to have Amanda come and share some of her research that has been looking at urban places in the Midwest in particular. So Amanda, it's all yours, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Steve. That was a great intro and a very great setup. All right, so I'm going to get my slides on here. All right, hopefully we can all see the slides now. So Steve, thank you for the intro. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for being here. Great intro. Thinking about, do jobs follow people or people follow jobs, right? So if, as Steve said, that, jobs are starting to follow people, then this totally upends economic development policy. Now we need to start thinking about quality of life. So I want to start with Ohio. So Ohio's Economic Development Agency had a new marketing strategy. On the left here, you see a billboard they put up in Times Square, basically telling all the New Yorkers, hey, your buildings are taller, but our taxes are smaller, right? Come on over to Ohio. So the last I checked, Ohio did rank 5th lowest in corporate income taxes. They're right, really low taxes, but we also ranked about 37th in job growth, right? So what's going on here, right? Is it really just, oh my gosh, all those irrational companies in New York, they just have no idea about tax rates. They've never considered that as part of their business model, right? Come on over here in Ohio. Maybe you didn't think about taxes, right? I'm going to show you one more billboard. So this is one that went up in Austin, Texas, where Ohio is saying, look, Austin, your cost of living there is so big. Maybe you didn't realize that. You should come on over to Ohio where cost of living is much lower. And if you compare the growth in population for Austin, Texas, that's that blue line, to Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio is actually our fastest growing metropolitan area in Ohio. Austin is not the fastest growing metropolitan area in Texas, but in terms of growth, it has been exceeding growth and now surpasses Columbus, Ohio, despite its high cost of living. So when I think about these billboards, and I really don't think about them as marketing, I think about it as like this bat signal. So I kind of envision, when Gotham City was in trouble and they sent out the bat signal and they're like, hey, Batman, come save us, right? It's really like, hey, it's a signal. We're struggling here and we really need some kind of economic superhero to come and save our town, right? So on the right is my envision of, this economic superhero that's just going to fly in there from this industry or this company, and they are going to save our town. So if you're a big fan of the Marvel movies, as my husband super is, I'm like, there's no superhero, man. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting. Superman, actually, I know he's supposed to be from Krypton. He's actually from Cleveland. I think it's interesting that someone from Cleveland came up with Superman, really wanting that superhero to come in and save this town. Right. So if you are looking for the superhero story and what I'm going to say today, I'm going to just bum you out right now. There's no superhero. There's no economic Superman on his way to fly in and save our town. It's just not the way it works. Right. So what is it? If there's no economic superhero, what is going to save our town? So as Steve said, there has actually been a very long evolution towards shifting our focus more on quality of life. And we started off working on this project, which we call the Quality of Life Revolution. And the more that we have looked into these trends, the more we have kind of called this an evolution. It's been happening slowly over time. So to a lot of people in a lot of areas, I think in the Midwest, it feels more like a revolution, a bigger change. But to people in other areas, it feels like an evolution. They've known this for quite some time. And generally what we find is that as incomes have increased, the demand just to live in nice places has also increased. So as soon as we connected that first intercontinental railroad from Chicago westward out to California, it opened up migration to the Sun Belt even before they had air conditioning. So if you look back to marketing that California did in the 1900s, they very quickly marketed themselves as this comfortable, healthy home, right? They kind of stumbled into this idea saying, I think people might just like a nice place to live. Hollywood itself was actually created by a Midwestern woman who just wanted to create a nice place to live for all these nice Midwesterners. California stumbled into this idea very early on, and it paid off for them. But it's been going on for quite some time. So this is Nicholas Barbin, an economist from 1690, who the language is a little bit not how we use here today. But basically what he's saying is when we think about why we do anything, why we buy what we live, why we, why we buy what we do, why we live where we do, right? What causes economies to grow? What increases trade? He's really saying it's not necessity. If you think about what we really need to live, it's actually very little. So here, think about food, water, shelter, maybe clothing. We don't actually need that much. Most of our increases in trade and economics is really about what we want. We want a new shirt. We want, a cooler video game. We want a park near us. It's really been about what we want for quite some time. So Nicholas actually came to this realization watching the fashion industry grow and then increase for the cotton trade, which then eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. So he saw what was going on with fashion and said, this is really about what we want more than what we need. So when we think about what do we want, right? A lot of what we want is just a nice place to live. And as incomes have grown and we can satisfy those basic needs, that really increases the demand for living in this nice place. So this is a picture of actually the town I'm in right now. So this is Hudson, Ohio, which I think is super charming, which is why we chose to live here. So you can see our downtown and our, cute little bookstore. Right across from this picture that you can't see is, our historic clock tower. And then we have some very good schools. And all of these things, when I think about quality of life, those are the types of things that I think about. And as we've seen, a lot of the quality of life literature, at least the traditional quality of life literature in economics, has really focused on large cities. So this is a quote from a paper that basically realized, look, the success of our cities, and here they're thinking large cities, it more and more depends on cities' roles of consumption. Basically, can you give people what they want? If they want a restaurant, if they want a bar, if they want a store, if they want, good schools, can you give people what they want? So this is a quote I pulled from a recent Economist article, basically saying, yes, mayors are now shifting their focus from attracting firms towards attracting residents by improving quality of life. Mayors have shifted now thinking about, when we think about economic development, we should be thinking about how do we pull people here, basically those jobs first, or the people first idea, and then the jobs will follow those people. So here, this is a smattering of pictures I pulled actually from Indiana, of thinking about some of the things that they've done in Indiana to make various towns nicer places to live. And when we think about, all right, what do people want? How do we figure that out? So we could ask, so this is from a Michigan economic development organization who came up with this very creative, if you remember the Game of Life, I don't think kids play that now, but if you remember the Game of Life, they came up with their own Game of Life board game. And as you played the game, it had you write down things about what you think might make this corridor nicer. And this is how they got responses from people to figure out, what do you actually want in this corridor to make it a nicer place to be in, to live, to work. So we could ask people. So as economists, we tend not to talk to a lot of people. I'm not really sure why. We're getting better about this. So I do appreciate you having me here today. We tend not to talk to people. And there's a number of reasons, why we don't. We're maybe not that likable would be one reason. But I think the other reason is you don't always get a representative sample, right? So as many people who did this board game and filled out, here's what I would like in this, street, might not be representative of everybody. Not everybody had time to play the board game. So if there's any mayors out there, or any city councilors, right? When you've been to a city council meeting, you hear from your constituents. So when I talk to some mayors and city council people, they know that the people that come to those meetings are not a representative sample, right? Doesn't mean they shouldn't be listened to, but that they might not represent everyone. Not everyone can make those meetings. Here, I think about a busy mom with young kids. She's probably not going to a lot of city council meetings, even though she probably has some strong feelings about what would make her town a nice place to live. So what we rely on with our work are what we call revealed preferences. We just wait for people to make choices and then look at the choices that they make. We look at where people choose to live. We look at the house that they buy. And then we can now see, we know where they've chosen to live and we know what they're willing to pay for that house. And then we can ask the question, why? So this real estate agents, I feel like, get really, really well, right? When they talk about a price of a house, they say three things are important: location, location, and location, right? Why are those three things so important, right? So when you think about the price of the house, inherent in that price of the house is all of the stuff nearby. It's a nice neighborhood. It's a good school district. It's walking distance, to downtown. All of these things are kind of the premium people are willing to pay for a house to live in that location. So the quality of life literature found that people are not only willing to pay a premium for their household, for their house to live in a nice location, they're also actually willing to give up some of their wages in order to live in areas with a high quality of life. So what that means is we can look at housing prices and we can look at wages, and we can use those decisions people are making to then infer something about that location. What exactly are they buying to be near? So we use these markets as a way of kind of seeing, do people put their money where their mouth is? If they say they really like parks, are they actually willing to buy a house that's closer to parks, for example? Now, most of this literature focuses on very large cities. So here we're talking large metropolitan areas. So one thing we wanted to do is focus on small cities. So the first thing we wanted to do is create a methodology using the data that we had. So in small cities, we have a little bit less data. So we could get an estimate of quality of life for every county across the US. So this is a picture here where darker blue is our nicer estimated quality of life using housing markets and labor markets to estimate this. The darker reddish orange color here is lower estimated quality of life. And so you might pick out kind of some regional areas. So you might see kind of that Appalachian area pull out as having lower quality of life. So it's a little bit hard because you don't have quite defined state lines, but you can kind of see Wisconsin there. You see pretty decent on quality of life compared to some other areas. And the nice thing about this method is we can also infer quality of life, not only from the decisions residents are making, but we can also then infer things about the quality of the business environment. So here we think households, if they really like a place, right? If they really want to buy that house in that location and pay that premium, right? Businesses are similar, but businesses would also be willing to pay higher wages to locate in a place that really has those very productive people in that area. So we can use the same data to then estimate the quality of the business environment. And so you can see some similarities here and some overlap. So if you look at the West Coast here, right? Yes, people like beaches, right? In case you did not know, people like to live on the beach. You can see the mountains there. Yes, people like mountains. This we would expect. But you can see those same Western areas are pretty good for business as well. And you can see for the business environment, that Northeastern seaboard is estimates pretty high for its business environment. So now what we want to do, now that we have this estimate of quality of life for every county across the US, we want to compare it to the quality of the business environment and see how does this impact population growth and job growth. So the first thing we did is we looked at quality of life in one study with my co-authors from Ball State, Mike Hicks and Emily Warnell. We looked at we focused on just small towns or micropolitan areas. And what we find is that higher quality of life, small towns are associated with higher population growth, more people, but they're also associated with higher job growth. So those results are actually stronger for the Midwest. So what I've pulled out here in these two graphs are all of the small towns in the Midwest. So on the x-axis there, we have our estimated quality of life. And we can see on the left, higher quality of life is associated with higher population growth. And on the right, that higher estimated quality of life is also associated with higher job growth. So when we do the same thing for our estimated quality of the business environment, it matters less. So generally it comes out for most of our results to be just not statistically significant. In some cases here in the Midwest, that quality of the business environment really actually ended up decreasing our population growth and basically no effect for job growth. So when we think about all of these small towns, right, what we're thinking about is what is the premium people are willing to pay to live in those nice places? And we can start to pick out and kind of categorize all of these towns. So the top blue corner are the highest quality of life towns. So you can see Walworth County in Wisconsin, where University of Wisconsin-Whitewater is, right, comes out as one of these very nice small towns. College towns tend to do pretty well on our quality of life measures. And so really that blue box are kind of the towns that we think are the small towns that have the highest potential for growth. So the green box in the top right also has pretty decent quality of life. The bottom yellow box is more focused on the quality of the business environment. And the bottom left red box, I would say of all the boxes, if you're thinking, which box do I not want to be in? It's the red box. So the red box is generally where we estimate people don't particularly like it, but businesses don't particularly like it either. So the red box would be a box, sorry, Lewis County, Kentucky. It's just a box. If any box you can avoid, that would be the box I would say you would want to avoid. So the next question we wanted to ask is, great, now what actually makes a place nice? So you have these nicer places. They seem to be associated with population growth and job growth. What makes them nice? Why do people like these places? So this is one. So this was actually really fun. We threw every amenity we could possibly think of. So I think our data set, I should have counted before I came. I think our data set now has about over 200 different variables and location amenities in there. To think about, let's just throw everything at it and see kind of what pops out as the most statistically significant, what's really driving quality of life in these places. So the first thing we think about is natural amenities, right? So we saw those beaches, those mountains pop out. Yes, people like nice weather. Yes, people like mountains. So this graph is looking at the natural amenity scale from the USDA. And yes, we see, better natural amenities is associated with our higher estimated quality of life. Right? Not super helpful for policymakers because you can't build beaches and you can't build, the Rockies, right? But you can build on the natural amenities that you do have, right? So other things that start to pop up when we look at what is driving quality of life in places, are we see anything that is building on your natural amenities, right? So if you take the hills you do have and you have ski slopes, if you have bike and hike trails, recreation, it could be on all the lakes, right? So now we're thinking fishing, boating activities, right? So now what you're doing is you're building on the natural amenities that you do have. And so the other things that pop out here, so we've kind of categorized these into natural amenities and then our private goods and services. So this could be arts and culture. So art stores would come up there, and food stores. So here I think about some of this is about kind of what we need and what we want, right? So we still need our necessities. There's not going to be a lot of people who want to live in a place where there's no food store nearby, no childcare available, right? No internet, right? So we need our basic necessities met. We need things like food stores. Food stores is one that regularly popped up, is like, yep, we need to have food nearby to buy, which makes sense, right? We need things like food stores. We need to meet our necessities. And this is pretty common, we think, for all communities, that you need these necessities met. But then on top of that, we also kind of want what we want. And what we want might be different than what our neighbors want. So this is where I think some of the towns can really think about what makes them unique and what are their comparative advantages, whether it's their natural amenities, arts and culture. What can they build on to make a unique shopping area or make a unique restaurant or bar or a unique, winter playground. All of these things I think about. So you kind of have both. You have some standard things across all communities, and then you have, how do we make ourselves unique and different from other communities in a way that people, want to come here and enjoy this. So then we look at public goods and services. So some of the things that stood out were things like low crime rates, right? People want a safe community to live in, a community that offers better health outcomes. So that could be access to doctors, hospitals. It could just be promoting a healthier culture, biking, hiking, that type of thing. But then also connectivity. So when we think about the community that we do live in, are we connected, say, to a metropolitan area? So a lot of what we focus on here are small towns. And occasionally you might want to go to a large metropolitan area. And, for me, I've got the Guardians in Cleveland up nearby, right? Occasionally I might want to drive up there and see a Guardians game, right? So am I connected to that metro area? Or, Steve mentioned remote work, right? Can I live in a more rural small town and occasionally when I need to drive into work that is, not too far away? And then also we think with the connectivity are things like broadband, right? So can I work from home? Do I have the ability to work from home in these places? And of all of our amenities, one of the most, no, the most consistent finding, and in terms of statistical strength, strongest was school spending. Do you spend on your schools? So when you think about choosing the house you live in, every real estate agent will talk to you about the school quality and what they think about the school quality. Is it a good school system? Even if you don't have kids, right? Why would they do that? Right? They know school spending is a desirable attribute for a house. And so the school quality is really important because families, especially families with kids, really want to locate in an area that has better school quality. So here I think you need, a lot of the basics in terms of public goods and services, and some just across the board things that people need kind of as a baseline, and then you can kind of build on there in terms of the amenities. So when I think about kind of broad, what this research is showing, to me, I kind of think back to a business mindset. So I think in a business mindset is you can't really attract new clients if you aren't making your current clients happy. Word of mouth kind of gets around. And so it really is focused on your current clients, and your current clients should come first. So when you're thinking about meeting the needs of current residents, right? So now you're thinking about those things like food stores and schools, and make sure you're meeting the needs of your current residents. And then I think about also, are you meeting the wants of your current residents? Do they want more recreation? Do they want a splash pad for their kids, or a cool park, or more arts, or more culture? What things do they want? Are there new things? Are there innovative ways you can come up with unique aspects for your community? But you're really focusing on your current clients first, which can be a little bit harder. It's kind of easier to have a one-track mind and say, I'm just going to go after this one company, right? This is really getting down with the community and figuring out what do they like about this community, what can we build on, and also maybe what is our community missing that they would prefer to have. So this is from actually a different piece of work. Is some of your clients might be women. All right. So why am I talking about this? Why might this be an issue? So a lot of our mayors, so actually most mayors are men. And the issue with this is men, sorry for the men of the call, appreciate you being here. You're not known for knowing what women want as well as knowing what men want. And so what that means is we could have unmet needs in communities. And things we just didn't think about are needs and wants specifically for women. So what we looked in this research is we wanted to look at, are there differences between men and women and what they want in their town or their city? And we basically found in general, men and women kind of prefer, like, or don't like the same things. It's right. It's not that, women love the beach and men are like, oh, beaches are awful. Who wants to go to the beach, right? They both generally like beaches. Now, where we find the differences are really in the degree of the preference. So both men and women prefer lower crime rates, but it really affects women more than men. So environmental quality was another one. Both men and women prefer places that has better environmental quality, but it matters even more for women. Same thing with parks. So another big thing we found was egalitarian gender role attitudes. Here, both men and women actually preferred egalitarian gender role attitudes, but women showed stronger preferences for it. So what this map is showing you here it's a degree of difference. So the larger the circle is not population here. It's actually how different are men and women's opinions on these cities. And the black dots are actually cities that women prefer. And the gray dots are cities that men prefer. And we wanted to map it to see if we were, biasing against one region or another, or if there's any kind of regional differences. And one thing that we did find is that women showed some regional preference for the Midwest, that for whatever reason, that they liked the Midwest a little bit more than men did. So what that means for a lot of Midwest towns is you have, I think, an opening to really, think about, what do women want? What do women need? And are you meeting those needs? Are you thinking about, environmental quality and parks and school spending and all of these things? And there, I think a lot of times, in rural areas, especially with remote work, You can live in these gorgeous high amenity counties, but something that we might forget is a necessity there is childcare, right? So I've done the pandemic with no childcare. Luckily, my kids are in school right now. Otherwise, you might hear one wander in and tell me they have to go to the bathroom. It doesn't work for anyone, right? So a lot of these rural areas, again, you're kind of meeting those basic needs, right? You're going to need childcare to really get people to move to a rural area and work there, even if they're remote workers. And so there, we're really thinking about, who your current residents are, what their needs are, and making sure we're getting the needs of kind of all of our, residents that live in these cities. So here, I think a big overarching theme is really thinking about kind of what Steve said in the very beginning. Is it jobs or people? Which one comes first? That kind of chicken or egg question. And really what we find is it's people. It's really focusing on people. It is thinking about people first and jobs follow. And so I'll leave you kind of with this anecdote from my co-author who's in Muncie, Indiana. So if you've heard of the Ball Corporation, the Ball Corporation moved to Muncie, Indiana, over 100 years ago, basically saying, Muncie is not particularly appealing, but good enough. They've got natural gas and we could use some natural gas and I'll get some rail out of that. So Muncie or Ball Corporation moved from Muncie to Boulder, Colorado, right? So they actually moved from a very kind of low cost of doing business place, Muncie, to Boulder, which is not known for being low cost of living. It's higher cost of living. It also has higher taxes, right? So why would they do this? Why would Ball Corporation move from Muncie to Boulder? And basically that's where the people were. And so you might have a new, let's say, Ohio State grad who says, you know what, I'm moving to Boulder. That's where I got a job. I got a job at Ball Corporation. And people say, see, he's following the job, right? People follow jobs, but we don't often stop to question, why is that job there? Why is Ball Corporation in Boulder, Colorado? Because Boulder has been focusing on quality of life basically since it started, where Muncie didn't. And it let things, especially like schools, go down and a lot of the public spending go down as they started to chase a lot of these economic development things like tax breaks and the economic development marketing we started with. And what that really did is it came at a cost, and it came at a cost of quality of life, things like school quality and their local amenities. All right, so I will end it there. So I also have the presentation. If anyone wants a presentation, I can give you links to some of this research, and I like to stop it there and ask questions and see what you guys think. And it looks like we do have some chat up.
Yep. So I'm going to go back. We'll let people chime in here too, but just to go, there was a question early on in reference to a lot of the examples you gave were related to businesses going there, but how does remote work fold into what you presented and what you talked about? Is it just businesses that are going there and then people follow, or the jobs are following the people, or is remote work incorporated into that?
So what we've looked at so far is that we think remote work has increased the trends that we have seen with the increased importance of quality of life. And it actually puts slightly more weight, we think. So we're using both housing markets and labor markets. Over time, it puts more weight on that housing market. And so this gets in kind of some of the details of the quality of life literature, where we think those housing markets are really picking up even more of this than the labor markets are, because the labor market is becoming less tied to the area that person is. But as far as we can tell, and so we have kind of some initial work on this, is that we think the remote work has really increased the importance of quality of life. And here it increases the importance of all of it, right? So places that had really, nice local amenities, but also had all the basics, right? So had, decent schools and broadband or something else. Those were the places that really saw, we think, the biggest impact from the increase in remote work and the increasing importance of quality of life.
And there were also a slew of questions related to the variable construction. So what variables contributed to quality of life? There was one about the quality of business environment as well. So if you could just talk a little bit about some of the variables that you used.
Yeah, so there, what we're looking for is we're really looking for what is the premium people are willing to pay to locate in that place. So here what we do is we start with housing data. So we take the house price, and then we have some estimates of, the characteristics of the house. So we have things like the number of rooms, the age of the house. And so what we do is we look at all of these characteristics of the house. How does this drive the house price? And then we basically have a leftover portion. And what we do for our model is we use this leftover portion of housing prices for each county to then use that along, and we do the same thing for labor market. So we know average wages, we know things about the labor market, we know, general education levels, we know industries, average age, all of these things that increase your wages. And then there's kind of this leftover portion. So we use the leftover portion from these housing regressions and these wage regressions to then use that as kind of the premium. What is the premium you're willing to pay for that house above how old the house is, above, how big the house is, the number of, bedrooms, as the premium you're willing to pay for that location. And so we can use that premium people are willing to pay to then get for on the quality of life side. If you're willing to pay higher housing prices and a little bit lower wages, it must be a really nice place. On the business side, you're willing to pay higher real estate prices and also pay higher wages in order to locate in this place because you really like it. So businesses typically, if you really like it, so the example of Ball Corporation, like there tends to be, you have really productive people, right? So why did they move to Boulder, Colorado? That's where they can get the most productive people. If you think about Silicon Valley, right? You have really high real estate prices. Also paying those engineers and those computer scientists out there pretty, good amount. Why do they really like Silicon Valley, right? That's where the really productive people are. And so this is how we're then using to get across every county, our estimate of quality of life and also the quality of the business environment.
Wonderful. There was also a conversation when you were talking about school spending, and there was one in particular that said, I would like to see more about strength of school spending in determining the strength and a basically timely data point on community. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, the school quality literature is really interesting. So the school spending one, we have another measure of school quality. And it really comes out as school spending. And it reminds me a little bit of the literature that I've seen on education spending. So generally, it's kind of mixed results as far as I know in terms of what actually produces better results, right? So better results could be testing scores, but testing scores might not necessarily be exactly better results. But generally, what we see is that, school spending matters to parents. Now, whether that actually matters for outcomes might be different, but at least what we think is that parents think it does. So whether it actually matters or not might be debatable, but parents think it matters in terms of the outcome their kid is going to get. So we actually have recent research from my colleague at the University of Akron, Ali Anami. So he actually focuses just on Ohio, and he looks at school spending and the various ways that it can be spent. And he finds that the most productive way it can be spent in terms of outcomes, in terms of test scores, is on teachers and basically salaries. And basically you get an especially big bump if you really raise the salaries for teachers who are in the districts with the lowest paid teacher salaries. And so that's actually pretty recent research out on school spending. But it's definitely still stuff economists are kind of researching in, effective ways. So as far as my field goes, some of it is, and community economic development, we might be able to debate how much school spending actually helps a child, how much more money they need. But if parents think it does, then that's what's going to attract and keep people.
Great. And following this, if I know you have some research papers and some are behind paywalls and others that through Brookings Institute that sort of talk about it, but if any recommendations that you have on the article front, whether it's the construction of your indicators or else otherwise, please share and I'll post those online so folks can have access to them.
Oh yeah, definitely. So the Brookings paper is a nice intro, no crazy equations. If you want all the Greek letters, so the paper that most of this research came from is actually open source. So anybody can read the paper and I can just give you the link and anybody can read it.
Perfect. So we have a question from Lissa. And she asks, when does the decline start? That point when the quality of life deteriorates. And she refers to Boulder because we all love the quality of life in Boulder. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have not checked, I think some of what you guys like kind of non-linearities, right? At some point, do too many people like it? So this one actually has interesting gender implications, right? So as soon as everybody likes a town, everybody comes there, right? But now you're dealing with traffic and potentially higher crime just when you get more people and you start to get these congestion effects, these negative effects happen. So what we find in our research on gender is those congestion effects I just described, higher traffic, it could be environmental quality, they actually affect women more than men. Right. So now if you're really thinking about, can I fill that gap? Women care more about addressing those congestion effects that can happen when a lot of people like a place than men do. But there it is, it's definitely, it's a balancing act. And that's something that I think, this is why I'm glad I'm not a city council person, right? Because we would, we want this lovely city to live in and there's never any traffic, right? And we can go wherever we want. And that's just not reality, right? Your city should probably have some traffic. I would say, if anything, if your city has no traffic, that would be a bigger concern than if your city does have traffic. And I know that's something I don't know how city council members tell people that, or maybe I don't know. I'm not a politician, so maybe they shouldn't tell people that. But it's definitely a balancing act, right? Having these nice places means a little bit of congestion, but when does that congestion get too much? And I think what we see right now with the quality of life literature, and actually we see this between this urban rural. So what we actually find is that quality of life mattered more for small towns right now in our most recent data than it did for urban areas. So even though previous literature said, hey, this is great for urban areas, right now, so it's about 20 years later, we find that it seems to be even more important for small towns. And probably because those small towns don't have to worry as much of the congestion effects that big towns do. I don't really know if that answered the question.
Amanda, if I can follow up on that.
Yeah.
Paul Krugman, the Nobel winning economist, and the New York Times columnist, the new economic geography with all that centripetal and centrifugal forces. Some of the research that's been coming out is when the cities get too big and it starts to bleed out. That literature is really talking places like Mexico City. There are these really, really massively large places. Perhaps places like Los Angeles, where it's just too big and too congested. I think for the Midwest, that level of congestion, we're really not there. We've got maybe the Twin Cities. We're seeing some of that spilling over into Western Wisconsin. How much of that is because of congestion or higher crime rates or pollution? It's hard to tell. Chicago to a certain extent. But, based on that research, you're talking really big places.
That's right. I would say in the US, it's more kind of inefficient growth through reducing housing supply. So basically, if you have this cute little town, as I think I do, right? You have a lot of the town members here really try and restrict any development of housing in places where people really want to be, which is when you get super sprawly and kind of the growth I think people don't like.
I'm Josh. I hope you're comfortable asking the question. Josh he's a colleague from across the state. He's asked a few different questions related to housing and the price premium. Josh, did you want to ask about that? Maybe he's not on. The question that he was interested in is, so the price premium seems to be tempered by those areas that are successful at addressing housing supply, running counter to how this quality of life metric is measured and defined. He had used that or suggested that a few different times about when you're actually increasing the housing supply, you're reducing the cost of the housing in the community, which makes it more likely that people can move into that community. Can you just talk about that dynamic?
Yeah, so that's a hard one. It's one that we haven't really dealt with, I think, enough. And I want to. So basically what you get is when you have a really nice place to live, right? People try and keep it for people who are currently there. So you restrict the housing, which will also bump up your own housing prices, which is great if you already live there. But what that does in our model, it also means that we basically would estimate that as a higher quality of life because those housing prices went up. So I think this would be an interesting thing to think about. So as far as our estimates on quality of life, as much as, especially as an economist, I don't like that people restrict housing supply, especially in order to boost their own housing price. But what we see is we think in high quality of life areas, you're probably especially likely to do that. And I think it reinforces the estimate of our quality. I think it would reinforce our quality of life estimates. So you get those especially high quality of life places are where people do go out of their way to restrict the housing supply, which then drives up housing prices. So I think it's related, but we haven't actually netted that out.
And he said that his audio is bad, so he's still here. He just didn't have his audio present. So there is a question from Mia. What about inclusivity as a criteria for quality of life? Many communities may have some great things to offer, but perhaps not always being welcoming and inclusive to non-white populations.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So one thing we wanted to look at is when we thought about inclusivity and outcomes for people. So one thing we also looked at was how quality of life affected poverty rates. So we found also that I didn't show here that higher quality of life actually decreased poverty rates in towns. So in terms of welcoming people, so we have some measures that we have just added on that we haven't included. So we have some gender role type stuff that I've done in previous work. And so basically what we find in the gender work is if you have more egalitarian general attitudes, so women particularly like it, but also those cities that have them and those places that have them, they actually do better. So I know there's also research on, so it's kind of, it's like political attitudes when we think about things like immigration, is in a lot of places when we think about immigrants as one of them, people may hold anti-immigrant views, but typically those anti-immigrant views don't apply to their own city, they apply to someone else's city, right? So here you might be like, oh, I'm not for immigration. Oh, my neighbors who immigrated, they're fine. I'm talking about in Texas, right? And so something that we can kind of, I don't know if misinterpret that people's, political views about people, for example, immigrants might not match their own views of the people in their own town. And I think a welcoming kind of aspect of a town is also important. So one thing we find in the Midwest is that it has especially high social capital. And that social capital can help it make it welcoming, probably especially maybe for people who look like me. And that's something that, women like that we think. As far as race, so we haven't done as much with race yet. So for that, an interesting book, if you haven't read it, is Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, where Heather McGee actually does economic development policy. And the book is all about economic development policy and race and a little bit about history. But basically an interesting thing, because she kept as an economic development policy person saying like, why can't we just have nice things, right? Why did, our community pools close? And race kept kind of bubbling up. And so basically what she finds is this bubbling up of, our, feelings about race actually hurt communities by taking away amenities that were for everyone, whether it was a community pool or it was a zoo or the parks. And as I was reading that book, all of the things that she mentions that we took away because of, our feelings of race at that time, really also I'm finding are actually really great things to have. Community spaces like parks and pools are great for quality of life and growth. And so I know there's a town in Ohio, so it's Lima, who's getting a brand new community pool. And I was like, yes. So that was a kind of cool. Also, and Lima's new mayor is actually a woman of color. So it's a place where I think that there are a lot of places that we can do better than we did historically in the past. The community pool is one example that I was kind of excited to see, that I think we're, moving beyond there. But I tend to think we're all more alike than we are different. And so I think there's a lot more opportunity for towns, and towns are a lot more welcoming than, I don't know, sometimes maybe media articles would show. I don't know if that really answered the question, but we haven't done as much with race. But for that, Heather McGee's work is quite good.
And I'm going to pause on the comments box and questions, and I invite people to unmute and ask the question themselves, because sometimes people like to do that. So would anybody like to ask a question?
This is Steve Deller. I'll get it going. Amanda, as you've been talking with local officials and maybe state officials around Ohio about this work, how's it being received in terms of kind of the policy implications? And the reason you started off basically saying Ohio is very old school in terms of tax incentives and, you know, how are they reacting to this kind of new way of thinking about things?
So it depends who it is. So the urban planners that are in Ohio, this is obvious to them. To a lot of residents, when I talk to residents, I think they take it in and they kind of see that this is right. For a lot of the economic development community, this is a hard sell that I'm making for them. So hopefully I did my best, but this is a hard sell. And it's been interesting because I've also actually talked with economic developers and city managers in Boulder, in the example I said. And this was not even a hard sell. This seemed painstakingly obvious to them in Boulder, where it's really interesting to see how painstakingly and obvious it was for kind of the Boulder city manager, where here I really have to work for city managers to kind of to get on board. I don't know if a lot of them are on board. Maybe we'll get there. But I think really the feeling is with a lot of these traditional economic development policies as well, they're not great, but I think it's the best we can do. I don't know that we can do any better than this. And I think it really sells our community short. And I think when residents actually hear that's what they think, I think they no, it's selling them short. I think Ohio is more than, for example, Goodyear. And I think if any town thinks all they are is their one company, I don't predict strong growth for that town, that those towns have to be something more. But I do also feel some of the gender stuff that we kind of discount and why we're talking about gender then comes into play. For Akron, where I am, so we were the rubber capital of the world, Goodyear, Firestone, all of these companies, right? This is who we are. And so I was talking with that kind of developer and he's saying, man, so it's actually for our leadership Akron. And I want to ask everyone and find out how everyone is somehow tied to the rubber industry. And and this is leadership Akron, I think there's about 70 people in the audience. One person out of 70 was actually tied to the rubber industry. No one else had a family member that worked in the rubber industry. And his face was just shock. He was sure that they were going to have this discussion about how everyone in the room was tied to the rubber industry. And 1 out of 70 was tied to the rubber industry. So I think it is a hard mindset to change, that we are different now. And maybe we kind of weren't as tied to it as we always thought we were. And it's thinking about what identity can we have that is not just tied to this company, to this industry. And we have to be something kind of more than that. And that's something that is a really hard culture shift to happen. Oh, I see that comment from Ann. Yes, that makes me happy to hear. Well, so I would also say, I would think based on my own non-statistical things is that I think Wisconsin is ahead of Ohio on this. I think for a lot of Midwestern places, a struggle. I think Ohio, Indiana, especially a struggle. I think Wisconsin's ahead of Ohio here. I think Michigan's a little bit ahead of Ohio too. Don't tell my husband I said that.
This is being recorded.
Oh no.
Yeah.
It's too late. Cat's out of the bag.
I see, Andrea, I don't know if you turned off your, I saw you have a question in there, but I see you also have a video on. So would you like to ask a question?
Sure. I mean, if you have time still, I know it's getting close to that.
Oh yeah.
No, I liked how you were mentioning how like one employer could have different impacts throughout the community, like the trailing spouse, families, and everything is kind of connected. But are there specific metrics that we could like track with future incentives and policy going forward? I know we've talked about different statistics that you've been tracking, but some of these are more, not as hard data, I'm guessing. Is there a point where we can, I don't know, make that distinction when we're looking for investments in our communities?
Yeah. So actually I have two things. So one thing, I feel like sometimes this presentation, it can come off as me saying, oh, businesses suck, they're all terrible, but actually businesses have a really important role, right? So businesses can actually contribute to the quality of life, or right? They could also hinder it. So they could be the new business as a new restaurant. They could also be a business who's maybe not that, but they make sure to give their employees time off to make sure their employees can enjoy the town. And that's really important too. So the other in terms of metrics. So one metric that I didn't show here that we think is kind of important is when you track net job change. So what often happens with the economic development folks sometimes, and sometimes the politicians, is they love to go. So it happened here in Youngstown. And so Youngstown lost our GM Chevy Cruise plant. So it actually made national news when this happened. So it was about 5,000 jobs we lost. I think it's maybe a little under 5,000 jobs. And then a little while later, there was a big press release. Look at this win. We have a new, I think it's a battery thing coming in, and we're coming 1,100 new jobs. Isn't 1,100 new jobs fabulous? Now, what they're not saying is losing 5,000 jobs and gaining 1,000 jobs is still a net loss, right? So even though you spent this money, you're still at a net loss. That's the real question, why you're at a net loss. So what we find is what we like to look at is if we look at net job growth over time and break it out. For one way to do it's kind of a crude measure is education. So even in Ohio has had job growth for college educated workers. If you look at non-college educated workers, we have had job loss. Over the last 20 years, Ohio on net has not added one single job for someone who doesn't have a college degree. For the US, there is some net job growth there. A lot of it's in the service industry, right? So this is another thing in the Midwest, we love to talk about manufacturing, despite really we should be talking about services. I think every county should be talking about services way more than we talk about manufacturing, just given the share of the economy it tends to be. But looking at net job change over time is one, right? So what that really gets at is it takes away this message of this, press release of, look, we gained 1,100 jobs. And what this helps, I think, especially reporters and people do is then to question, now you need to answer for the net loss of 3,000, right? It's still a net loss. Why is it a net loss? Because this is the wrong strategy. You are going after, it tends to be manufacturing where it is more capital intensive, less labor intensive. So that's an issue, but it is also taking away from in Youngstown where they have, a really bad school district. So now you're giving millions of dollars in an area where they have a really bad school district and they're still wondering why they're at a net job loss because they're, wrong strategy. So I think net jobs is a big one. So we focus on college and non-college. Another thing that we focus on to look at net job change is, so my co-author likes to call it footloose and non-footloose jobs. So we've tried to rebrand that because it's kind of confusing. It's kind of global jobs and local jobs. So a global job, if I think about here, would be Goodyear. Goodyear's a global job because they make a tire that could then be used anywhere in the world. Although they don't actually make tires anymore. Where a local job might be a doctor's office. It might be a salon, right? If I cut hair, I cut here, right here in Akron, right? If I make an ice cream cone, I serve that ice cream cone right here, right? I don't ship that ice cream cone off, to anywhere else. So that's a local job. And so those local jobs are tied to the local economy where the global one is not. So when you look at global job change versus local job change, what we see is that long trend of increasing number of local jobs and a declining global jobs, right? So then if you're really trying to, spur growth or pick winners, like politicians like to do, what you should really do is the local jobs, but that's not what those incentives do. Those incentives try for those global jobs, the, manufacturing plants, chip facilities, whatever it is, where really you have those local jobs are where we've seen most job growth, net job growth, where we've seen net job losses in those global jobs.
And I promised Sean in the private chat that I'd give him a chance to ask a question. He has his hand raised. So Sean.
Oh yeah.
Great presentation, Amanda, and great to hear from you, Steve. I was a community development extension educator in Illinois and northern Wisconsin, where I knew Steve, and then now in Nebraska for the last 15 years. And as you know, Nebraska's got a lower population than those other states, including Ohio. And so I would say most of our local economic development professionals and politicians, like you mentioned, they're starting to get that this quality of life is a new strategy. So I kind of appreciate that. I really like the chart since they're starting to get that about the men preference. If you go back there really quick, I was curious at the bottom, it looked like it was over New Orleans, a big black dot there, which that seems contrast to how you explained it, like, because that seemed like a higher crime area. So why would there, whereas you had said in the Midwest, which I think is kind of something that we can market, being from the Midwestern states that I was representing. So if you could explain, because I was a little confused on that particular chart and using that kind of as a marketing strategy for the communities that I work with in Central Nebraska. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's not New Orleans, and I'm totally spacing what city it is now, but it's a different city in Louisiana that is actually one of the highest ranked cities for women and not men. Men just kind of think it's an okay city in New Orleans. So so I'd have to go back and check the data, but just, having been in Louisiana a couple of times. And so one thing that we find in the South, so one thing we are worried about is, are we just discounting the South, right? Oh, all women hate the South. And that's actually not what we found. There's a lot, it's a smattering where we have, so what I think is going on there is you have a lot of Southern cities. So here, Savannah was another one, if I'm remembering right. And there's this town in Louisiana, and they tend to be towns that are walkable. They have a lot of restaurants, park spaces, and those type of things. So one thing we find for women is that women especially like restaurants. So both men and women like restaurants. We like restaurants. Women super like restaurants. So having a lot of restaurants. So one thing that I find when I go to other cities compared to Ohio and is when I go to the South and to a lot of these other towns, they have so much innovation and entrepreneurship, I find, in even restaurants and shopping, where I don't see as much of it here in Ohio. And I see even like going for brunch, there's maybe a handful of places to go to brunch for millions of people in Northeast Ohio. I'm a big brunch lover, where if I go down to, last time I was at New Orleans, right, you can throw a rock and hit 10 different brunch spots. So I think some of it goes down to some of these city fundamentals, walkable, parks, restaurants we find. And then some of it is, I don't know. We have to go in the town. So it could be other things that are super nice about the city that we just don't know about.
Thanks. That's wonderful. Like, mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy.
I have actually started a presentation that way when I talk about that paper. Yep, that's kind of what we find.
Well, we are a few minutes over, and I'd like to try to keep these to the hour. Thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing your work. And yes, I have been getting some chat comments privately. The video recording, the slide deck, and any links will be on our website, and we'll try to get it up as soon as possible. And if you registered for this event, we will actually send those out, so you will have access to them. So again, thank you, Amanda. It was a pleasure, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Brandon. Thanks, everyone.